Welcome this afternoon. Today we have two local authors, and we have Joyce Keller Walsh, who all of her books are up here as you can see. Joyce is a published author and a playwright. And on my right, Jean Dulett, who has spent years doing a lot of research on the cemeteries of Lakeville and parts of Middleborough. So, and you are self-published?
Yes.
And what your journey doing that is what you're going to be speaking about?
Yes.
All right, and you want to go first?
Yes, she
All
wants
right.
me to go first.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Like she said, my name's Jean Dulett, and I have published two books on cemeteries, local cemeteries. The first one is Lakeville, Massachusetts gravestone inscriptions, 1711 through 2003. And in that book, I transcribed what all the gravestones in the 31 cemeteries that I was able to get into, what it said on the stone, descriptions of the stone, maps of the cemetery with the location of each gravestone noted, and also photographs. The second book is Tack Factory Cemetery, and that's a single cemetery. It's on the border of Middleborough and Lakeville, up on Taunton Street. And I did the same with that, the inscriptions, pictures, a map. But I also researched the people buried in that cemetery. And that's where the fun was. I really enjoyed that.
What was the name of that one?
Tack Factory Cemetery,
Factory.
and the people buried at the border of
Yeah.
Middleborough and Lakeville. It's a
Yeah.
long title, and there's a reason for that, which I will get into. I didn't decide to self-publish at the very beginning. I was going to use a genealogical publishing company called Heritage Books. But when I delved into it a little deeper, most of their books were 6 by 9 inch. Now, I had written my book as if to be printed, so 8.5 by 11, basically. And when I shrunk it down to fit their 6 by 9 size, I found that the maps, the numbers got so tiny you couldn't read them. So the only alternative was to have like 2 pages per map, and that just didn't work well. So I looked elsewhere, and I remembered old cemeteries of southeastern Massachusetts, and some of you people, if you do genealogical research, will be familiar with that book. It's 8.5 by 11. It was the right size. And I spoke with William Sowold, the publisher, but he said that if you do a book that big, it'd be basically this big, okay? You have to do it in 2 columns because it's too hard for people to read all the way over and come back and get the right spot to start again. Well, that didn't work well for my maps or even my pictures, so I didn't go with him. And then when I was at Ted Williams' camp at some function, I spoke with a woman who had self-published. I believe she was with a writers group here at the COA, and this was many years ago, probably 15 to 20 years ago. And she recommended that I self-publish, which I hadn't really considered before. She said, oh, it's so easy. She used County Press on Commercial Drive up by the train station. She said, oh yeah, they print it. Great, great. Well, okay. So I decided that that's the route I was going to go. Now, before you get your book printed, you have a lot of decisions to make. First of all, you have to decide the dimensions of your book. And as you can see, I'm somewhere in between 6 by 9 and 8.5 by 11. I decided not to go with 8.5 by 11 because it wouldn't fit on a library bookshelf correctly. It would be turned like this. And I didn't want the book like that because I thought a lot of people would just walk by and not see it. So I played around with how much I could shrink it and came up with a 7 by 10 size. You could still read the maps and the numbers and everything. Another thing you want to decide on is the font. Now, I've read a lot of self-published books, and they use this fancy font, and I found that hard to read. So I went with basically newspaper font, Times New Roman, with my first book. And then on the second book, I switched to Century School Book, which I'll get into why in a little while. You have to decide on the font size. Well, I was middle-aged, well, still am, at the time I wrote the book. And I was having trouble reading books that were font size 10, much less font size 11. So I decided on 12. It's a little bit bigger than what you see normally, but I figured my audience, who would be middle-aged or older, the people who are interested in genealogy, they would be able to read it much easier. Then you got to decide on a title. And I know my titles are kind of boring. I mean, basically, it's no fancy title. But if you're going to sell your book, and you want, especially online, you want a title that can easily be searched. So I needed words like Lakeville and Middleborough and cemetery and inscriptions and gravestones in my titles. And that's why they're kind of wordy and a little bit boring. Then you need to come up with a cover design. Now with this book, I made about 6 covers. And I took it around to town hall, everybody I know that would talk to me about it, and asked them, which cover do you like best? And by far, this is the one they like best. So that's the one I went with. And then you have to decide on the name of your publishing company. Now, I thought I was being pretty clever. Urn and Willow. You see this design, the urn and the willow, all over Lakeville. There's hundreds of gravestones in the early 1800s that have this logo, various styles, depending on the carver. And I thought it was pretty clever. I think I was wrong. I had my son order a printer for me in this process. He's a techie. He got on the phone, placed an order for my printer, and the printer came. It was addressed to Urn and Willow, but it was spelled this way. Business people. Okay? So I had that problem with my book. And then another problem I had was speaking with somebody who was very well versed in the cemeteries in Lakeville. And we were talking about my book, and he kept referring it to and Willow. I'm like, no, it's Urn and Willow. He said, no, it's and Willow. And I said, where do you get that? And he picked up my book, pointed to the name of the publisher at the bottom of the spine, like any other book. It looks like So when you shrink the type down to fit at the bottom of the spine, it comes together, and you can see, especially the people in the back, what does that say? Looks like So choose carefully. Then you want to decide if you want to have your book proofread. When we write things, we don't notice our errors. We keep making them over and over again, and we proofread them, and it's still there. I mean, we just don't notice them. So I looked into professional proofreaders, and they charge by the page. Well, this book is 463 pages long, and half of it is inscriptions, maps, photographs. I thought, I don't think that's for me. So I asked friends and relatives to proofread my book for me. I had a few problems there too. One fella kept wanting to change what was written within the quotations that was in italics. I said, no, you can't change that. That's what's carved on the gravestone. You can't change that. I wound up firing him. The second problem I had was people who just wanted to read my book. They didn't really do any proofreading, and that was quite a disappointment. Another problem was people that didn't return my copy in a timely manner. I said, how about a month? Can you get this book done in a month? They said, sure. And week after week, I didn't get it back. So that's a problem. By far, the best proofreader I had was a recent high school graduate. The laws and rules of grammar are still fresh in their mind, and they remember that, and they can proofread it so well. I used my daughter Laura for that. She graduated from high school shortly after I wrote the book. Now, you've got to decide if you're going to sell the book or if you're going to give it away. Print a couple dozen and just give it away to friends and family. Well, I wanted my book to get into libraries throughout the United States, so I went the sell route. Now, if you're going to sell online or in stores, there's a few things you want. First of all, you want an ISBN number and a barcode. Okay? The ISBN number is unique to your book. If somebody plugs it into the search engine, your book comes right up. Now, Amazon and eBay, you almost have to have an ISBN number to sell on those modalities. And also the barcode is very important for retailers. They can just use their scanner and the price comes up and everything. It contains a lot of information on it. If you might want to have your book copyrighted. I have mine copyrighted. Maybe that's not important to you. It's your choice. And you want to get a Library of Congress control number if you're selling to libraries, because they don't really like to handle self-published books unless they have that number, because it contains all the information they need to put in their card catalog. Now, the ISBN number you can purchase at Bowker.com, BOWKER.com. The copyright you get at Copyright, and that's RIGHT.gov. And the Library of Congress control number you get at LOC.gov/publish/PCN. And the last thing you want to do is determine what you want to price your book at. I looked at other reference books similar to mine and found out roughly how much they charge per page and followed that suit. Next is to print your book. Like I said, I used County Press up on Commercial Drive. They were wonderful with me. They print you a demo, an actual hardbound book as a sample, and you look through it and see if everything is the way you want it, and then they print it. Also, they had never published in 7x10 size before, but they were willing to do it. It's kind of a unique size. And they said they loved the size. It fit in their boxes that they had, and it just worked out very well for them, so they were going to try to get more customers to use that size. Now, while your book is printing, you have to get a Lakeville business certificate if you're in Lakeville. It's basically a certificate that says you can sell things within the town. Also, you want to get a sales and use tax permit from the state of Massachusetts, and that's what this is here. It says, I am authorized to collect sales tax for the sale of my books. Every year or quarter, depending on your volume of sales, you have to submit a compilation of how much sales tax you got, and send it to the state. It's either you have to do this online. They don't do written anymore. Everybody's going online, I suppose. And also at the end of the year, you might want to do. Well, you have to do a Schedule C because you're a bona fide business, and you have to include that on your tax return. So, when I got my books back from the printer, I thought, yes, I'm done, finally. No, you're not done. Unfortunately, you have to sell your book now. And that's what I found the hardest, selling my book. It involves giving talks like this, going places, visiting retailers, talking them into selling your book, maybe making a web page, putting an entry on Amazon or eBay, and then the orders trickle in, and you have to mail them, package them up and mail them. So, that's my journey into self-publishing. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a bunch of questions about all those documents, the copyright and the Library of Congress number,
Control number.
That, is copyrighting a book, is it difficult? Is it expensive?
No, you have to fill out an application and you have to send them a copy.
So it's not like copyrighting a new device that you might have made. I mean, that's very involved, I hear.
Are you talking about a,
Invention, I guess.
that would be
patent.
a patent, yeah.
Oh, patent,
That would be
okay,
a
I'm sorry, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right. And then getting your book, the library number, that was that
That
difficult?
was not difficult, it's a matter of applying online.
Really? Okay.
Sometimes they want some money.
Okay,
They
yeah,
won't lie to you.
of course.
It's usually not too much. All of these little things, but by far, you want to have the barcode. Very important. If you don't want to copyright, you don't have to. If you don't want to
Well,
number
it
control
seems
number,
to me
don't
if you
have
did all that work, then,
to. Yeah,
you know.
yeah, Brian?
Did you have to get a trademark
No.
for your company?
Well, I didn't. I could have, I suppose. But how many people want that?
Which name?
Yeah.
Yeah. I did find that with a title like this, I get a lot of emails from monument companies, people that sell urns, things like that. Yes, in the back.
Could you tell, what did you do differently with your second book?
Well, I switched the font, because I didn't want any more ums and willows. And basically, I researched the people. I spent a lot of time researching the people and writing about the people in the book. And like I said, it was fascinating. I found that all but one person buried in that cemetery was related to other people. And I have given a talk on this cemetery before. And I have a whole chart with string between the families. It goes everywhere. You've seen that,
Yeah.
right?
Does say Tack Family Cemetery, right?
No, it's
Factory,
Factory.
factory.
Yeah,
Right, right.
actually, on the other side of 18 from the cemetery, there actually was a tack factory there. Unfortunately, it burned down.
I live right near there, I walk by that every day.
The cemetery?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm interested in the cemeteries on 79, where the golf course is, there's 2 cemeteries there. I understand one time one belonged to a church, it was given to the town,
Yes.
and then I'm gonna be buried there. And I wanna know, I'd like to know more about those 2 cemeteries.
Okay.
Which one of those books will give me the information I'm looking for?
Every cemetery, I start off with a paragraph talking about the cemetery, where it is, how many people buried there, the first grave.
And how it became a cemetery? About the church and everything?
It talks about the church, yeah. It used to be part of the Lakeville United Church of Christ,
Okay.
and the town got it in 1972 from the church.
And how come the town created a cemetery next to it after or before?
After. Precinct Cemetery is much later, yeah.
Yeah, and why did they separate it? If the town owns both cemeteries, why did they keep it more or less separated?
Well, because when Thompson Hill was still owned by the church, when Precinct Cemetery, which is right next door,
Okay.
was created.
Oh, all right,
So the precinct did not belong to the church. That was a town cemetery.
right.
From the beginning. I believe it was in the 1940s. And then the cemetery, or the Thompson Hill Cemetery was turned over to the town in 1972. So you're talking a few years difference there.
Okay. All right.
Any other questions?
I think that's the, I'm gonna get that.
How many years did it take for you to prepare your first book, the research?
Almost 8 years. Now, I did stop around the holidays, from Thanksgiving to Christmas, because of family duties, but yeah, about 8 years. Because a lot of these stones, it's very hard to read, so I would go back again and again, trying to use different light, different times of day. And I devised a couple tricks. And so the actual going through the cemetery and writing the transcriptions down was a lot easier with the second book. You learn as you go on.
And how long did it take you to do the second one?
About 18 months. Yes, ma'am.
How do you decide how many books you order? Can you order 50 and then you get more, or how?
Yes,
what
you
is
can
that?
do that. I had talked to a woman, I went to the Association for Gravestone Studies meeting, and I had found a woman who had done that for a cemetery up in Maine, and I asked her, well, how many have you sold? And she told me, and so that's how many I have printed up. Yeah. Yes?
Who are some of the individuals that you found fascinating buried here in Lakeville?
Individuals I found fascinating. Well, I was amazed at some of the richer, perhaps, families in town, like Montgomery. You've heard of Elder's Pond? Well, that was named after Elder Montgomery. And he and his family are buried up in Thompson Hill Cemetery. And there's this monument. It must be this wide, this deep, and about this high. All it has on it is Montgomery. That must have cost a fortune, made out of granite.
They must have had money.
I had money, yeah. So, there was one person.
Are there any other questions?
Did you grow up
Thank
here
you.
in Lakeville?
Oh, no, I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio.
From where? Why the interest in Lakeville?
Well, when I moved here, my father told me, oh, you should research your genealogy because his family stems from the Mayhews in Martha's Vineyard.
Oh, okay.
You ought to become a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution because he fought in the Revolutionary War. So I started researching my genealogy, and then when my youngest daughter went to school, I found myself with extra time. And I was looking for somewhere to volunteer, and I just decided to do that because at the time I was trying to research my genealogy in Cincinnati. And it's hard when you don't live there, you know?
Yeah.
And there was someone who went to the library every week and she would look up my relatives, which I thought was very nice. And so I thought I can record what's here in the town. At the beginning I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. At first I thought I'd put it online, but then I spoke to a man who had Cape Cod genealogy website, and he said, yeah, I spend 6 hours every day answering emails. And I thought, I don't have that kind of time. So I decided to put it in a book, try to get it in all the libraries, the genealogical libraries, and let it be there. And I was a dentist, and a dentist has to be very particular and very precise in everything they do. They work in such a small area. So I was really picky. I mean, I would spend 20 minutes trying to find out, is that a period or is that a comma? Is that a 5 or is that a 3, you know? And I'd go to town hall if I couldn't figure it out. I did a lot of very much checking and rechecking everything I put in that book.
Thank you, Jean, that was fascinating. Now, Joyce?
Thank you for coming, and thank you, Jean, for sharing this time with me. I chose the topic, Lakeville and the writing life, because I'm going to speak about two, in addition to me, two, and I'm not the successful one, two very successful Lakeville authors, both nationally and internationally. And the first one I know personally because it's my husband, John Walsh. Some of you may know him from his television show on WGBH back in the day, which was called Walsh's Animals, and he's appeared on many television programs. Most recently, I guess it would be the Channel 2 Nova special, which was called Saddam's War on Wildlife, which delineated his time in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War when he was cleaning the oil-soaked waterfowl. Unfortunately, that program didn't cover the most dramatic part of his stay there. He was there for about a year. He went from Saudi Arabia into Kuwait to take over the Kuwait Zoo, which was in deplorable condition. And he also went into the oil fields and he rescued the camels and the horses that were going to die. He brought those back, and in fact, years later, not so long ago, I guess it was maybe when this show aired on Channel 2, he got a call from a veteran in Texas, and the soldier said, I saw this special. He said, you know, we were stationed on the Ring Road outside Kuwait City, and we would take bets on whether or not you would come back alive, because it was all mined. And he'd go out in his Jeep, and he'd have a couple of men with him sitting on the fenders looking for the mines, and he'd go out and he'd grab a camel, drag it back, go out and grab another camel, drag it back. So that we had no idea that was going on. Anyway, he only wrote one book called Time is Short and the Water Rises, which unfortunately is out of print now. This one book, was not only a bestseller in the United States, it was a bestseller internationally. It was translated into 7 languages, one of which was Japanese, and it was condensed in the Reader's Digest. And what it describes is his first jungle animal protection, rescue, and relocation project. It was in Suriname during the 1960s, mid-60s. And what had happened in Suriname, which was then Dutch Guiana, was Alcoa had a boom in aluminum. They had discovered the flip-top can, and so they needed aluminum, and that comes from bauxite, which was plentiful in Dutch Guiana. So what they had to do was construct a hydroelectric dam, and as they did that, all the jungle floor behind the dam rose. 10, 20, 30, 40, we're going way up in feet. And all those jungle animals were going to die, either of drowning or starvation. So there was a new organization called the International Society for Protection of Animals, which contacted the MSPCA, for which John worked at the time. His area as an agent, by the way, is Bristol and Plymouth County. So this is how we came to Lakeville. And he was 24 years old, and they assigned him to go down to Suriname to see if it was possible to rescue and relocate these animals. He had never been out of New England. He had never conducted any project like that, and off he went. And I guess he was a natural because he and his team, which were Saramakan, these were indigenous people. I call them indigenous. They were really slaves that were imported into Dutch Guiana during the 16th and 17th, 18th century to work on the plantations. And in the 1700s, they successfully revolted. And they left the plantations, and they went back into the jungle, surrounded by water, very inaccessible. And they lived there as they would have lived in Africa, very, very well. These were the men that he recruited to help save these animals, and the book talks about this. They saved and relocated nearly 10,000 animals, every variety. 9,737, to be specific. Unfortunately, no movie was ever made of this book, because back in that time, they didn't have animatronics, they didn't have computer graphic imaging, and to do a movie in a jungle with animals was not feasible. It is more feasible today. I'm still hoping sometime that might happen. He went on, as you probably know, well, you won't know, but he did many other projects. He's been in disaster areas all over the world, including floods, earthquakes, war. He was in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the war there. He's had a fascinating life, and I wish he'd write another book, but he's not inclined to do so. Anyway, that's our Lakeville author number 1. Our Lakeville author number 2 is very successful, who you may not have heard of, is Major Arthur Hamilton Gibbs. Now, he was born in London, but he came here in 1920 after he married an American wife, Jeanette Phillips, whose father owned Phillips Farm in Lakeville. She actually was an author herself after she married him. She wrote 4 very interesting and very well-received books herself. But Arthur, when he came here, he was about 32, and they lived in what was around what would be Heritage Hill now, near the golf club. He was an avid golfer even back then. So they never had children. The 2 of them lived there. He died in 1954. He had written almost 20 books. But most of them were written here. not all of them, but most of them. The book that brought him to prominence was a World War I book of his experiences as he was in the cavalry at that time, in the British cavalry. And it was an anti-war book called Gun Fodder. And it was very significant, and it was very shaking, because it was really the soldier's eye view from the trenches and from the back of a horse of what it was like in World War I. He was very disillusioned, by the way, as you might expect. Came to the United States, came to Lakeville, and here he lived for the rest of his life. And in that time, he wrote so much, including, I'm going to name three very important books that he wrote. One was called The Persistent Lovers. Not that the book itself is that important, but it was made into a movie. So we have a Lakeville author who's had a movie. It starred a very prominent British actor at the time. Then he wrote another book which came to prominence, was the best-selling book in the United States in that year, 1925, he was here, called Soundings. He also wrote a book called Chances. He wrote that in 1930, while he was here. And in 1931, it was adapted for film, starring Douglas Fairbanks Jr. So you can imagine, I mean, this is, I don't know if anyone who knew him knew just how important a writer he was. Not only was he an important writer, his family was an important family of writers. His father wrote 2 books. Unfortunately, only one of the 2 is available. I was able to get it. It was published in 1897, 700 pages. I'm still wading through it. And he had 2 very, very successful brothers. His eldest brother, Cosmo Hamilton. Hamilton was the mother's family name. He was born Charles Hamilton Gibbs. Cosmo wrote dozens of books. He was a playwright, a director, and a producer both in London and New York City and Broadway. Very famous at the time. His next eldest brother, Philip Gibbs, was a World War I battlefield journalist who was knighted for his journalism. So he is Sir Philip Gibbs. And he wrote about 80 books, at least. So I've been acquiring all of Jeanette Phillips' books. Most of Arthur's is one that's not obtainable. Some of Cosmo's, here I'm very familiar, Cosmo's, some of Phillips, and a lot of background. And I'm doing a biography of, this is my next writing project, a biography of Arthur and his family in World War I. And this is going to be probably years of research and writing, and I'm just having a wonderful time doing it. So I wanted to introduce those 2 people to you because of successful writers, neither one is me. I don't sell books anymore. These are leftovers from when I used to do craft fairs and everything. I just don't have the wherewithal to do the fairs and everything anymore, and I've never been a very good seller of books anyway. I began as a playwright, and I was lucky enough to have plays produced in Boston and off-Broadway. And in fact, I've just finished will probably be my last full-length play, which Peg Hosmer, if you know her, she's a director and producer of Theater One Productions in Middleborough. We had a table reading of the play not too long ago, and she's going to be doing a staged reading of the play in Middleborough in the spring, and I will try to let people know when that occurs. I wasn't born in Lakeville. I came to Lakeville 45 years ago. I was born in New Jersey, and in Secaucus. We lived in my grandmother's house, and my mother and father had a little bungalow, and I mean it's just a bungalow, in New Jersey, South Jersey, not on the water, not anywhere near the shoreline. We had no amenities. There was no electricity, there was no running water. We had an outside pump, an outhouse, no heating other than a kerosene stove that you would bring from room to room. So it was very primitive. And we spent most of our weekends there and almost all of our summer. The reason I bring that up is that in my latest book, The Feather Tree, which is the 4th and final book of the Pittsburgh County Chronicles, I place the main character, Elmer Goodson, who is an elderly recluse, in such a cabin in Pittsburgh Woods. and there he lives and has lived for a long time. So I kind of had a sense of what he would be living like while he was there, simply because I harkened back to my own childhood. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book and then take any questions that you might have. Let me just take a little water. Let me give you a little background on this book. There are 2 ghosts involved in the book, and a murder, 2 murders, and there will be a resolution. Elmer's lived alone for a very long time in the woods, and he's at a cusp of being very unhappy with his life. So he says, he opens up, this is the beginning of chapter 2. Great Spirit, Elmer said, looking skyward from his Adirondack chair in front of his log cabin, why the foolish hell am I still here after all this time? By here, he didn't mean in Pitsley Woods. He was here by himself in the cabin where he'd lived for nearly 30 years. He'd cleared the land, poured the cement slab, felled the trees, and built his home. He'd salvaged everything else from the junkyard and dump, only buying his bed from a factory outlet store. Here in Pitsley Woods was his sanctuary. But here, as in still alive, confounded him. You kept me here. Why? Haven't you taunted me enough? Why do you keep me here? For retribution? Is that it? Surrounded on all sides of his clearing by the tall pine trees and oaks like Stonehenge, he could sense the waning of summer by the slant of the sun and the aromas of pine, wild blueberries, and basil. He breathed in the ripening tomatoes in his garden and the smell of the swollen ears of corn. He measured the vines of zucchini and beans, whose leaves were as large and full as the palm of his calloused hand, and heard the hickory nuts plunking onto the roof of his outhouse. All these herald the coming autumn. He was well past his own autumn, well past maturity. He should have been plucked from the soil a long time ago by the gardener. What am I supposed to do? Dry up like an old potato dropped on the ground and left to rot? Is that your idea? Is that how I pay for my sins, by letting me turn into an old dog turd? What did this great spirit in the clouds that he talked with, prayed to, railed against, look like? Sometimes it was the figure of an African shaman dancing in a ferocious mask. Sometimes it was a Native American mother bending over her earth cradle. Today it was an elusive face, impassive, opaque, ever-changing, intangible. He rubbed his swollen knees through his worn denim jeans. The knuckles of his hands were beginning to thicken and gnarl, even though he massaged them every night with WD-40, the way the old-time Yankees did. He was getting rusty, like the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. But the Tin Man had no heart to attack, no heart to break. Lily, my love, long gone, he thought, then put away the memory. Looking up again, Goody pointed in the direction of the tree line. Well, at least you sent me company, although I'm not sure why. Perhaps it's a trick. I know you have a strange sense of humor, Big Spirit. An apparition had shown up several months ago, in spring, but it seemed to be coming closer now. Lately, when he was picking summer squash from the garden patch, Goody would look up and find Janine Badburn at the end of the row, watching him with intent blue eyes, her long blonde hair flowing around her as though she was swimming underwater. Sometimes he would see her looking at him through his kitchen window with implicit entreaty. And sometimes, when he sat outside husking corn, she seemed to hover among the pine trees, just out of reach. Poor murdered girl. What is it you want? He repeatedly asked, and repeatedly failed to get an answer. Did she actually see him? Or was she merely like a dandelion seed, gliding on breezes wherever they took her? 3 years ago, he'd been the first to find Janine's body as he did his daily walk through the woods. She was almost obscured at the bottom of a hollow. He wasn't sure exactly when she'd been put there, but he left her in repose for others to unearth, which they did. Although the police later learned that Janine was the victim of a crazy religious cult, they never did catch all the zealots involved in her death. By the count of the robes intended for the ritual sacrifice, there had to be one more member who belonged to the cult, but no one would disclose the 13th man, not to this day. Nothing he could do about it. He lived alone in Pitsley Woods, away from town, away from people, away from everything. His past, present, and future were sometimes indistinguishable from each other. And although he was still alive and Janine was dead, he felt they existed in the same dimension. Then, a short time ago, there came a second ghost girl, swirling around Janine as though playing Ring Around a Rosie. While there was no substance to her, it was unmistakably Donna Quint. The Lost Girl posters with her pictures had appeared everywhere. I'll leave it at that. So, any questions? I must say, as far as copywriting and ISBN, I've left that to the publishers. So that's the one thing about when you don't self-publish, you don't have to bother with any of those things if you can get a publisher. Feather Tree, I did self-publish, but I used an editor who actually did the proofreading, although I've noticed as you say, you can read through it 4 times and have other people read through it and still find a mistake, which I did this morning. She did the proofreading, she uploaded it to Amazon, and she did the cover design and the spine and everything. I'm not good at that technically. So I just shoved, and then she would charge a flat rate, which I found to be very reasonable. So that is my last novel. And this other book that I'm working on, I don't know where it will lead me. I'm just having fun reading it and enjoying the research. Yeah.
When did you, so your first book was,
Duckets.
and when did you write that?
It actually started off as a play. Oh, God, years ago, decades ago. And I realized that it was just too big a canvas for a stage. And that's what led me to do it as a novel instead. And then from that came successive novels. And I still did plays, but not exclusively anymore.
And so how, like, when you finish one, are you up, or as you're finishing one, are you already thinking about what the next one might be?
Yes and no. I knew I had to finish Pitsley County Chronicles. It needed a resolution, and I wasn't sure how I was going to go about it. What I constructed was having actually 2 points of view. One is Elma Goodson, who I read, Goody, and the other is a woman whom he knows, who is the girlfriend of his closest friend, whom he doesn't care for all that much in the beginning. They're kind of like oil and water, and they see things differently, so I might describe something from his point of view that is completely different from her point of view. For example, there's a scene in which they're trekking through the woods together, and he looks at her and he says, "Oh my goodness, she really knows what she's doing, and she's seeing this murder from a point of view that I hadn't seen. She's sitting on the ground and she's looking from that point of view, and then, I guess she knows what she's doing." Meanwhile, she is thinking, "I am so exhausted, I am so tired, I've just got to sit here." And absolutely nothing to do with looking for the murderer. So they see things differently as it goes through the book, and then it converges. Well, I'm going to tell you the end.
Are all your books mysteries?
Almost all of them. Let's see, Sleuth Blog, which I don't have here, was an investigation of a real murder that happened in Fall River.
Which one is that?
It's not up here. It's just too big and too heavy to carry. I mean, this was enough. And the other one that isn't a mystery is Strumming the Banjo Moon, which is a straight kind of literary novel. But most of them have been, yes.
Aside from the biography that you talked about earlier that you're working on now, is it you prefer fiction to write in nonfiction?
I love research, so it's really...
Well, the research,
Yeah.
I understand that.
Yeah, so that goes into the nonfiction right now. Equally. I don't think I would pick one over the other. Most of my work life was nonfiction. I was in the Department of Epidemiology, so it's very much nonfiction. Any other questions?
Right.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Joyce.
Excuse me.